WVW Broadcast Network is pleased to present National Security Meltdown with host Philip Haney. As the author of See Something, Say Nothing, Philip is recognized as a credible national security expert and frequent guest host on national radio and television broadcasts, as well as a much sought-after keynote speaker. Philip is a charter member of the Department of Homeland Security with previous experience in the Middle East. As a DHS frontline officer and intelligence expert, Philip bravely tried to say something about the people and organizations that threatened the United States. Yet, his intelligence information was eliminated from the government database, and he was investigated during the Obama administration by the very agency assigned to protect the country. Through this broadcast, Philip will expose just how deeply the submission, denial, and deception run within our national intelligence agencies. Philip's years of being an insider allowed him to be an eyewitness to the federal government's capitulating to an enemy within and punishing those who reject the narrative of the deep state. Such dereliction of duty has led to a national security meltdown. And now, here is your host, Philip Haney.
Hello, everyone. The next topic in the series on national security meltdown is called The Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good. That's a long title, and some of you may have heard about this new emerging trend within the faith arena of Islam and Christianity and Judaism combining together to form an alliance of virtue for the common good. But some of you might not have. And you might also say, well, what does it have to do with our national security meltdown? Well, part of the way that we protect our national sovereignty in our constitutional republic is to recognize that the principles our country was founded on are actually biblical in nature, many of them. In fact, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are saturated with biblical values. So if the foundation of our worldview, our Judeo-Christian ideology that the country was founded on, begins to be undermined, then just like waves crashing against the shore underneath a house, inevitably it's going to begin to collapse. And I'd like to walk with you through this presentation on the Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good and show you that this is one of many threats that, taken together, I refer to as the national security meltdown. So let's look a little bit back to the very beginning. It goes all the way back to the year 622 and the beginning of Islam under Muhammad in the city of Medina, when he dictated or had written what was called the Medina Charter or the Medina Constitution. And believe me, when we're finished, you'll see how this all fits together. So we're going to go right back to the very beginning. The claim of Islamic scholars is that Muhammad actually wrote and promoted the very first constitution in the history of the world. And it's called the Medina Charter. He became the ruler of Medina after fleeing away from his hometown of Mecca and established a city-state based on the religion of Islam back in the year 621. It's called the Hijra, the immigration to a new place. And it sets a pattern for all Muslims all over the world from then, 622, 1400 years ago, up until this very day. And one of the parts of the Constitution, the Medina Charter, is, as you see here outlined in red, it says that they are one community to the exclusion of other people. There's actually nothing like that in our Constitution that specifically points out exclusions, but that we recognize that our liberties and our pursuit of happiness in our life comes from the Lord Himself, who endowed us with these. So right off the bat, we see what I would call a warning sign that embedded within the original Constitution, as promoted by Muhammad in the year 622, there's an exclusionary clause that the community would be Islamic in nature to the exclusion of all others. That's important to point out because as we go forward, we're going to see this idea being promoted that somehow Islam is compatible with Christianity and Judaism. I mean, the biblical religion, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that there's no conflict between them. But we'll take a look at that as we go forward. Now we see a book here by a man named bin Jamal Zeno called Islamic Guidelines. This is a very, very common textbook that's used in schools by children in madrasas, Islamic schools all over the world, especially in the English-speaking world. And one of the things that it talks about, as you'll see highlighted here, it talks about the people of the Scripture. Let's come to a word common between us and you, that you shall worship none other than Allah. In a sense, that's exclusionary too, isn't it? Specifically pointing to the worship of Allah. And that we will not associate anyone with Him, and that none of us shall take others as lords beside Allah. That's referring, of course, to Jesus. The prophet was at last forced to fight against the pagans and the Jews and defeated them. Well, this goes back to the Medina Charter that I referred to earlier, that this community would be to the exclusion of others. And after an initial overture, peaceful overture, for Jews and Christians to join this community as Muslims, when they did not submit to the Sharia law of Islam, Muhammad fought them and killed them. He himself led more than 20 battles, besides sending several expeditions under his companions to free the people of his time from oppression and the worship of rulers. So anything that is not submitting to Islam is referred to here as oppression. In Arabic, that's called fitna, and it's a very, very fundamentally important concept in the worldview of Islam, that anything from the outside that comes into the community that's not Islamic in nature is seen as a fitna, as an interference, as something that needs to be fought and destroyed. Next we have, some of you may have heard about this already, called the Common Word. It started out in the year 26 and 2007. It is actually promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood. It's called a common word between us and you, and I'll show you in a minute where it derives from a group called Al-Bayt, which means the people of the house, out of Jordan, Amman, Jordan, one of the central locations of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East. So from the very beginning, this movement that gradually become known as the Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good, initially was called the Common Word, was initiated by the Muslim Brotherhood, and that remains the case to this very day. So the Muslim Brotherhood is running an initiative to bring faith communities under the influence of Islam, and they have a very euphemistic title, the Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good. And we'll see how this unfolds in the next few slides. Well, here is where the term for common good comes from. It's from Quran chapter 3, verse 64. This is the verse that the common word is based on. And it says, as you can see highlighted below, "Say, O people of the Scripture, come to a word that is equitable or common between us and you, that we will not worship any but Allah, and not associate anything with Him, and not take one another as lords instead of Allah. But if they turn away, say, bear witness that we are Muslims and we submit to Him." You would think that if people who sign on to this agreement would have at least some degree of natural curiosity and want to look up exactly what it is that this ideology, this effort, this initiative, this coalition is actually based on. And especially if they're people of the book, meaning biblical believing Christians and Jews, that they would have a reason to pause. That do we actually believe that we should only worship Allah, and that Allah is the same as the God described in the New Testament and in the Old Testament? I think we would all agree, if we compare word to word, that they are not the same. And yet, this whole initiative is based on this phrase from Quran 364. Meanwhile, after the initial unveiling of the Common Word Initiative back in 2006 and 7, a large group of Christian theologians and leaders signed on to it. It's called the Yale Declaration for the Common Good, or Christian Response. And they are signing on to it that they will form this coalition. And some of the people that signed on to it back in 2007, a little more than 10 years ago, included very well-known leaders in the Christian community. Jim Wallace, president of Sojourners; Charlotte Ward, Auburn University; Charles Warnock, Chatham Baptist Church in Virginia; and perhaps best known is Rick Warren, founder and senior pastor of Saddleback Church and the author of The Purpose-Driven Life. So for a person who is well known to be a Christian leader and supposed to be fluent in the Scripture, to sign on to this should really make any Bible-believing Christian and Bible-believing Jew take pause and wonder, how could you sign on a document that emphatically states that we should all worship Allah? Here is a picture of Bob Roberts. He is the face of the Christian community for what we're calling the Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good. And next to him, on his right there, is Majid Ali. He is past president of the Islamic Society of North America, an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, and a known front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. And you may remember that I mentioned that this whole initiative was started by the Muslim Brotherhood out of Amman, Jordan. So this is July 23rd of 2015, not quite 3 years ago. Bob Roberts and Majid are promoting the Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good, also known as the Common Word. And now it's becoming closer to North America. Here you have in Toronto a convention, Islamic convention in Toronto, Canada, in December of 2015, where for the very first time this term Alliance of Virtue became public. It came out into the public use, part of the vocabulary. As you'll see, the highlighted portion says the theme of the 2015 event is the Alliance of Virtue, which organizer Samaya Puna said speaks to a need to form a cross-cultural alliance in order to aid and facilitate social justice. Now we know that that is a virtue signaling phrase, social justice, and you can probably guess that a large number of progressive leftist organizations have willingly joined in to this Alliance of Virtue coalition, which we will see as we go forward. Meanwhile, there's another variable in this equation, another moment in time where an event took place in Marrakesh, in Morocco, January 2016, just over 2 years ago. It's the executive summary of the Marrakesh Declaration on the Rights of Religious Minorities in predominantly Muslim majority communities. That's quite a mouthful, but the bottom line is that this year marks the 1400th anniversary of the Charter of Medina. Remember, I mentioned that from the very beginning. And what my point is to draw a sequence of events that lead us up right to the current time, showing you that this Alliance of Virtue actually originated from the very foundation of Islam itself, now more than 1400 years ago, and that they specifically point out that the Medina Charter, that exclusionary document that I referred to earlier, is part of the foundation of what we now know as the Alliance of Virtue. So this is an entirely Muslim-driven initiative. It's not a compromise offer with the people of the book, the Christians and Jews, that somewhere they'll find a meeting in the middle. No, it's a call for the people of the book, Christians and Jews, to conform themselves to the image of Islam. Meanwhile, November 21 of 2016, we begin to see press coming out, pointing the finger at, let's call us conservatives, MAGA, and Bible-believing Christians, evangelicals specifically, as we'll see in the next few slides. They're now beginning to express Islamophobia, some unwarranted, unfounded fear of Islam that is characterized as being a major trait of the Christian right. And if you look ahead, you can see how this whole narrative is being set up. We're going to have this grand coalition, but the only people that oppose it are these Islamophobic right-wing Christians. And you'll see as we go along that it's very specifically pointed out that Christians and evangelicals especially are the most direct enemy of this initiative of the Alliance of Virtue. Meanwhile, you have another variable in this large equation, this kaleidoscope of events that we're going over, and that is the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. They issued a fatwa right after the election in 2016 calling for an alliance of Muslim groups with progressive leftist organizations. And it fits right into this larger picture of an emerging coalition between leftists, progressive, liberal denomination Christians and Jews, and that they are going to form an alliance. But again, it's based on Islamic principles and values, not on biblical principles and values. Here we go. Now we're going to see this term more and more frequently used. Here's an Alliance of Virtue peace route start off in Abu Dhabi. This is where the effort to bring this concept literally to the doorstep of America began, in Abu Dhabi. And if you look carefully where you see where I put the circle, that you can see it refers right back to the Marrakesh Declaration. And then if you see circled, you can see the main leaders that I've already pointed out. There's Majid, there's Bob Roberts, and here's the Sheikh Ben Baya. He is Mauritanian, but he lives in Saudi Arabia, who issued a fatwa legalizing the killing of American soldiers in Iraq. This is the leader, the global leader of the Alliance of Virtue for the Common Good. The face of it in America in the Christian community is Bob Roberts here, and the face of the Alliance of Virtue within the Muslim community is Imam Majid, who again is a former president of the ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, a straight-up front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. So now we come to February last year. State Department embraces Islamic cleric who okayed killing Americans in Iraq. And on the left here is Sam Brownback. He is the new ambassador at large for religious liberty. And here is Sheikh Ben Baya, who called for the killing of American soldiers, who is also the face of this global coalition called the Alliance of Virtue. And this is the very first appearance in public of Mr. Brownback. And he attended this convention in Washington, D.C., called the Alliance of Virtue Convention. And here you see the headline, Evangelicals Join Interfaith Leaders in Washington to Promote Religious Tolerance. And what's interesting is the comments that were made during this conference, that these evangelicals, people that are part of the alliance, say that evangelicals and the conservative political parties' policies in the U.S. are actually hurting the most vulnerable people in the Middle East, in Islamic majority countries, pointing to the evangelical support for the Trump administration and his recent decision to declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel, despite widespread objection among Middle Eastern Christians. Now we're getting into the real deep theological water here. And you can see where the finger is starting to point toward the evangelical community as being the obstacles in the way of this glorious vision of world peace and an alliance of virtue for the common good. It comes down to the status of Jerusalem, and it comes down to, in particular, evangelicals. And why evangelicals? Well, I think everyone across the spectrum of Christianity knows that evangelicals are the ones that are most biblical literate and the ones who will defend the basic principles of the doctrine of the New Testament and are least likely to compromise. So we're being set up as the adversaries of this global vision of alliance of virtue for the common good. Here's the actual document. And once again, as you see down in the shaded area, the Marrakesh Declaration is referred to again, which was in turn inspired by the Charter of Medina. So just to reiterate, this movement, Alliance of Virtue, goes all the way back to the very beginning of Islam, more than 1400 years ago, and time again it's reiterated that this sequence of events is built on this archive of historical documents, including the Medina Charter and the Marrakesh Declaration, which again are entirely Islamic in nature. There are no biblical references here, no foundations of biblical principles that the alliance is built on. It's built on Islamic principles. And 400 leaders, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders, signed the Washington Declaration for Religious Tolerance back in February 8th of 2018, just over a year ago. To this day, I still have not been able to find the list of leaders who actually signed it, this 400 plus. Because last time when they signed the Common Word document back in 2007, they got a lot of pushback from the evangelical community for signing the Common Word document. So I believe, just my opinion, that they're avoiding publicity in order to prevent some of the pushback from people who would criticize them for signing a document that is so obviously completely Islamic in nature. And that is the status of it to this day, that we still haven't seen the list of the signatories for the alliance. Here you have a headline, How the National Prayer Breakfast Sparked an Unusual Meeting Between Muslims and Evangelicals. Once again, this seems like a complimentary title, but it's actually a poke in the eye, singling out evangelicals as being the ones who are reluctant to meet with Muslims, as though our biblical worldview makes us Islamophobic and predisposed to not cooperate with efforts like the Alliance of Virtue. Evangelicals are making it much worse. This is a Christian pastor, Bob Roberts, said of the negative views that many Americans have of Islam, and pastors are worse than the people in the pews. Now, this was said in public at the Washington, D.C. event back a year ago, and making it very obvious that those who don't join in this alliance are going to be targeted and ostracized and accused of being Islamophobes. Here's an article by Andrew Herod, who, by the way, is an excellent writer on these subjects. And he's asking the simple question, is the alliance of virtue or is it an alliance of vice? And I think that we will see that it's a grotesque lack of discernment, biblical discernment, that you form an alliance with a religion, meaning Islam, that if in particular denies the crucifixion of Christ, insists that Jesus is not the Son of God and never claimed to be, and that the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete in Greek, that is talked about in John 14 through 16, is not what we think of as the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, but is in fact Muhammad himself. Those three factors right there should be enough, if you don't know anything else about Islam, for any Bible-believing Christian to take pause about what's the true nature of this thing called the Alliance of Virtue. Now we go to last year, and we're finding out that meanwhile the Common Word document still exists, and it's self-described as the most successful Muslim-Christian interfaith initiative in history. A lot of us have heard about the Interfaith Dialogue. That's another name. Like you have America, you have the USA, and you have the United States of America. There are three different names for the same country. Here you have different names for the same movement, a common word. You have the Alliance of Virtue. You have the Interfaith Dialogue. And as we'll see later, you have Chrislam, a new term, kind of a hybrid religion between Islam and Christianity. But they all are referring to the same coalition, the same now becoming global level movement that we're seeing emerge more and more into the faith community. Meanwhile, it's overflowing into the political arena too. Last year, during the primaries in the lead up to the general election, there was a real strong effort for Christians to vote for progressive leftist Democratic candidates and to not vote for conservatives, and especially for President Trump and or any members who were running for Congress. And they were actively working against electing conservative candidates. So now you have the Alliance of Virtue starting out in the faith arena and then bleeding over into the social political arena. And that's where you start to see this coalescing of different leftist groups with faith groups into a very powerful force. Meanwhile, you have this organization, the Muslim American Society, with the Center for Interfaith Affairs here, a project that provides an avenue through which American Muslim community engages with interfaith community, there's that term again, and striving to promote the values of respect and understanding between religious and ethnic groups through dialogue and joint project initiatives that reinforce religious freedom, mutual respect, acceptance, and, what's the last phrase? Working for the common good. So we see this phrase, and I think if you listen going in the days and weeks ahead, you're going to find yourself hearing this phrase, common good, in both the faith arena and in the social political arena. And as I mentioned earlier, the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America has endorsed this through the Muslim community to form coalitions and do outreach with progressive leftist organizations. Meanwhile, it's also in the Catholic Church. As the headline says, a disgraced cardinal praised ISNA and true Islam. Well, what is true Islam? If you look at the Quran, Islam is very clear about fighting jihad and opposing the fitna. Remember I mentioned fitna, the opposition of the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. So I'm not really sure what he means by true Islam. My point is that it's also saturated into the Catholic Church as well. And here's what I mentioned earlier. A Christian group launches a nationwide revival tour to oppose Republicans in the midterms. And this actually happened. Again, the common word, bleeding, or common alliance of virtue, bleeding over into the political arena. And here's a coalition between CARE, another unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation trial, along with a group out of Minnesota called Isaiah, another alliance between progressive leftist groups and the Muslim Brotherhood, operating in real time, where they did a campaign to smear and discredit all of the conservative political candidates in Minnesota during the last elections back in November of 2018. Here's just a little bit of background on Isaiah. And then here's just another indicator of this growing movement that's bleeding over into the political arena. Pastors are asking Texas Christians to vote blue. Yes, we should, as believers, be involved in the political arena. There's no question about that. Because after all, the word politics, if you look up the original meaning, means the affairs of the city. But what we base our votes on should be constitutional principles and biblical principles. And if a candidate violates either one of those, we should by conscience not vote for them. Not simply voting for the blue candidates because they represent a movement away from the conservatives and the Islamophobes that are being targeted and singled out by the Alliance of Virtue forces. Now here we have, let me go back. This movement, by the way, the Alliance also has an annual event. This year it was called Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies. It's led by the same Sheikh bin Baya that I pointed out before. And if you want to read a very good compilation of what happened at this meeting back in December, look up these articles, part 1 through 4 by Andrew Herod. By the way, these PowerPoints will be available in the notes that you can refer to and look up the sources that I'm talking about during this talk. Here's another bit of information on this alliance. To help the societies and organizations struggle against oppression. Remember, I mentioned that word fitna before. And all kinds of immoralities, no matter under what name and how. But of course, they're not telling you, it's implied and understood by those who read this, that it's based on Islamic values, not biblical principles. So we're gradually being oriented, turned into a direction to submit and conform to an Islamic worldview. And it's having an effect on the faith community, and it's having a profound effect within the political arena. Here's a man, December 28th of 18, an imam that says, today's so-called Judaism is hijacked by fanatics, by Israelis, and that Jesus' true message was also hijacked. So here you start to see how it's going to work. It's like driving a wedge into a rock and then beating on it with a hammer. They're going to undermine the confidence that people have in biblical principles and say Islam is really the answer. And then we'll have this true alliance of people who were Christians, who were Jews, that join in this alliance of virtue, and we'll have a global movement based on Islamic principles, not on biblical principles. So the effect of all this is those who oppose this at local, state, national, international level are being set up for persecution. And it's expected that in the year 2019 and going forward that there's going to be more worldwide global persecution of Christians than in any time in history. Pope Francis is always also a part of this. This is just quite recently. He went to the UAE to meet with an imam from Al-Azhar University, which is the seat of the Muslim Brotherhood. So now we have the Catholic Pope forming an alliance with the imam of Al-Azhar, the Muslim Brotherhood, and saying that Islam and Christianity, as it says here, are equal in the eyes of God. Is that really biblical? I think everyone who has even a fundamental familiarity with the Bible would disagree with that statement. If Jesus said that I am the way and the truth and the life, and that no one comes to the Father but by me, but the Pope is saying that Islam and Christianity are equal in the eyes of God, again reminding you that Islam insists there was no crucifixion. And according to Paul, if there's no crucifixion and resurrection, then we are of all men most miserable, because our faith is in vain. So what is this really all about then? For the Pope to say that is actually heretical. So here's what I mentioned to you earlier. There's a new form, hybridized religion called Chrislam. And it's part of the Alliance of Virtue movement. And this particular person is saying that there's really no big difference between them. So why don't we just get together and form an alliance, a faith-based alliance called Chrislam. And then we have Shoulder to Shoulder, and you can see some of their, this is a leftist organization. But down here in the bottom right, you see one of their partners is ISNA, the Muslim Brotherhood Front Group for you. Here in the United States, former leader was the very leader, Imam Majid, who is the face of the Alliance of Virtue here in America. Here's a picture of him. This is Imam Majid right here at a shoulder-to-shoulder event in real time, just quite recently. So I'd like to thank you for your attention during this segment of the presentations on National Security Meltdown, and that it's important to understand that the faith community is a vital foundation and protective wall. against the forces that might come against us to undermine the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that God endowed us with, and that if we want to preserve our constitutional republic, that one of the things that we're going to have to find the courage to do is stand up and state plainly, as it says in the Bible, to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us, and not compromise, even under the threat of persecution, up to and including our own life, if that's what it takes. Because if things are left unaddressed and no one has the courage to stand up, you can be certain based on history, this has happened over and over again throughout history, that the Christian community and the Jewish community will be hammered. They will be killed and persecuted. It's happened so many times throughout history. We're not immune to it in 2019. So let us all stand up for what we know is right and true, and find the courage and the grace from the Lord above to represent Him in this world we live in. So thank you very much.